What advice do you have for somebody wanting to write a book?
That's a really good question. I was an English major in college, so and I had to do a lot of writing, and still do. Doing this book was different because I had to remember stuff that had gone on, and I'm really bad. I don't keep a journal or anything like that. So a lot of it was from memory. Luckily, I could do pretty good with that. But then I also had to reach out to people and get details about stuff. So I would just practice. I wish I'd kept the diary or a journal. That would have made this a lot easier for me. And that would just be the main thing. It just would be to practice as much as you can, and then figure out something you want to write a book. But I've been in WWE for a couple of years, and of course had some not very great success with a couple characters, and really they needed someone to work with the Undertaker, to have a match with Undertaker, and the idea was to put me under a mask and to have this story that Kane was the long lost brother of Undertaker and back to take his revenge. But it was going to be a one-off. It was going to be what wrestling would call hot-shotted, to where it's just they needed this done really quickly, and then for like the next pay-per-view or something like that. And then when I guess Vince McMahon really thought about it and digested the idea, he loved the idea of the story of Undertaker having a long lost brother from the past, and this fire, so he had to wear, the house burned down in fire, and had to wear a mask and all this stuff, and ended up being a 6-month build to the actual debut of Kane. And then 25 years later at this point, almost, the character is still kind of going. So it was really just one of those things where, for me, of course, it was the best break I could have possibly asked for. And I think it was something that came out of a necessity. How they say that necessity is the mother of ingenuity. I think it was one of those things where WWE just needed Undertaker to have an opponent, and that's what spurred the initial idea. And then the initial idea was really good, and they ran with it. And thank goodness they did.
What do we want to talk about?
I am him. I am him.
Hey, it's the Red Carpet Ring here, featuring the Turnbuckle King TBK himself. How you guys doing this evening? We got another great audiobook of the audiobook series that we have here at the Red Carpet Ring. This particular audiobook is by another WWE legend and Hall of Famer, Kane, and it's called Mayor Kane, My Life of Wrestling and Politics Audio Part 1. Now, there will be 3 parts of this audiobook. First one is here tonight. There will be 2 other parts. In part 2, there will be a link in the description when I do have part 2 of this particular part 1. And of course, in part 3, there will be a link to the previous part 2. So keep an eye out for that. Keep the notification bell on. Like and subscribe so you guys could be alerted when I have these audiobooks out for each part, because it's a 3-parter. So let's see who came in here to the ring tonight. Figure 4 TV, thanks for coming out. This is a great book. Heard's a great book. Heard Kane, he talks about, it's like a double thing. He talks about his wrestling career and his political career. And while we on the subject of his political career, I want to give a disclaimer. Kane don't only talk about his wrestling career. He does talk about how he enters the his political career that he is currently in right now, as he is the mayor of Tennessee. Just want to give you guys alert of that. Some of you may not want to listen to politics. You don't want to, get in all to that. That's fine. You want to, click off when he does enter the politics section of the audiobook. I understand, but this is Kane talking about his life. We know that he is not wrestling now. He's a mayor, and he's in the politics. He talks about how he enters the politics scene after, he pretty much stopped wrestling. Now, it talks about, of course, how he became the mayor, but he also talks about how it's wrestling and everything else. And he talks about how he's inspired to get into politics as well. But we know he's a wrestler turned politician. And he says politics is a contact sport, and he uses wrestling skills in that area. So, like I said, if you guys feel alerted, feel offended by any means, I understand, but this is him talking about wrestling as well. Well, we know Kane is a multiple-time world champion, Hall of Famer, Money in the Bank winner, main evented many pay-per-views over the years in the storyline, brother of Undertaker, as he stated in his audiobook. Now, just want to give a quick disclaimer, quick heads up about the book. What is it about? Now, with that being said, enough of me talking. I know you guys came here to listen to the audiobook of Kane. I will pull that up shortly, and we'll be about 2 hours in tonight, maybe a little over 2 hours, give or take or two. And then we'll do part 2 and 3 later on. I want to say first, thank you all to who want to listen to the audiobook tonight. Thank you all for supporting the channel. We are 1,346 people on the channel subscribers, on a road to 1,500, and then on and so forth. Thank you guys once again. With that being said, let's head on to the audiobook and see what Kane has to say about his wrestling career, and then him entering his political career, him becoming the current mayor of Tennessee. All right, we get that up shortly. You guys bear with me.
Hachette Audio presents Mayor Kane, My Life in Wrestling and Politics. Written and read by Glenn Jacobs. The statements and opinions expressed in this work are solely those of the author and do not reflect the views of WWE. WWE hereby disclaims any responsibility for such statements and opinions, and they should not be construed as representing WWE's position on any subject. Foreword 1. The Undertaker. It's hard to imagine a performer for WWE who has been more integral to the popularity and evolution of The Undertaker than Kane has been for over 20 years. It's also hard to imagine a better person in the pro wrestling business than Kane, aka Glenn Jacobs, who performed as my half-brother for many years. When Glenn entered the ring as Kane in 1997, many observers thought his career as a wrestler for WWE might be brief. The conventional wisdom was that I would work with him for a short period of time before moving on to other opponents. If you had asked Glenn back then, he probably would have told you the same thing. That's obviously not what happened. Kane became a force in his own right, headlining the biggest shows during the height of WWE's popularity in the 1990s. Having Kane, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, aka Dwayne Johnson, Mankind, aka Mick Foley, Triple H, and The Undertaker all in the main event mix during the Attitude Era. That was the time, from 1997 to 1999, when WWE's Monday Night Raw went head-to-head with World Championship Wrestling's
Monday Nitro, and it is a time I will never forget. That was like the Mount Rushmore of wrestling, with all of the legends on top at once. Nor will I ever forget all the great times Glenn and I had with the late, great Paul Bearer. Kane accomplished so much separate from his work with The Undertaker. From becoming world champion multiple times, to teaming with Daniel Bryan to form Team Hell No, and even going corporate to join the Authority, he has seen and done it all in WWE, constantly reinventing himself to repeated success. Still, whenever Kane and I, The Undertaker, teamed up as the Brothers of Destruction, no one could touch us. We were unstoppable. During the many years I've known Glenn, he has always been one of the smartest guys in the locker room. So I wasn't surprised when, in 2018, he was elected mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. I know how much he and his family love their home there and how passionate he is about politics and helping his friends and neighbors. Glenn might be the nicest guy in WWE, which is an accomplishment for anyone who has been in our business since 1992, when he made his wrestling debut. I'm sure Glenn will find politics just as challenging, but I know it won't change him. He is considerate and truly cares about others. The Glenn you see is the Glenn you get. Every day, both of us appreciate the unique lives we've lived in WWE. The stories we've told in the ring will remain etched in the minds of many long after we're gone. That's quite a legacy. For Kane and The Undertaker, I wouldn't change a thing that's happened over the last 2 decades. The Demon and the Dead Man's inseparable journey has been an incredible one. You just never know where the Brothers of Destruction might pop up next. Forward 2, Senator Rand Paul, Republican, Kentucky. My friend Glenn Jacobs has not only made a name for himself in the WWE world, but has been politically active and community-oriented for years, doing everything he can to serve his neighbors at home in Tennessee. When he was elected mayor in 2018, I knew not only that the people of Knox County had chosen a quality leader who would work hard for them, but a genuinely decent person who is involved in politics for all the right reasons. That's hard to find in Washington or anywhere else. I first met Glenn in New Hampshire in 2007. He was hard to miss. Standing head and shoulders above the crowd that had gathered to support my father's presidential campaign, Glenn's sheer size immediately captured one's attention. Like so many young people from disparate backgrounds, Glenn was a part of the Ron Paul Revolution, a movement focused on injecting libertarian and constitutional ideas back into a GOP where they had been missing or dormant for years. When I returned home to Kentucky from New Hampshire, many friends wanted to know if I had met other GOP candidates, like former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney or Senator John McCain of Arizona. But my kids were more interested to learn that I had met Kane. My middle son insisted on me getting him a Kane poster, and we went to see him wrestle in Diddle Arena at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green. Over the years, I've come to know Kane as Glenn and to appreciate his academic and intellectual talents, which go beyond his feats of brawn. In 2010, when I ran for an open U.S. Senate seat in Kentucky, I appreciated Glenn's support, and the feeling has always been mutual. 8 years later, in 2018, I had the privilege of supporting him in his run for mayor. It was an easy endorsement to make. I don't often get involved in state or city races because, frankly, few in my party understand that less government and more liberty are key if Americans are going to achieve their dreams. Many mouth the rhetoric because they think they're supposed to, but few follow through and take it seriously. Glenn actually gets it. He's thought about these ideas and about his own political philosophy in a deeper way than most. Glenn and I also both ran as outsiders. I had never held public office before running for U.S. Senate. I was, and still am, an ophthalmologist by trade. Glenn had never held public office before becoming mayor of Knox County. He had traveled the world as an internationally known WWE star for decades, something some career politicians might have tried to use against him. But the old rules don't apply anymore. People are tired of the same old politics. They want more outsiders getting involved in politics. Americans across the board are tired of the status quo. Just ask the current occupant of the White House. Glenn didn't need to become mayor. He wanted to because of his passion and commitment to public service. The fact that he's not a lifelong politician is an asset, not a liability. It's a big part of what makes him such a good mayor. Glenn's pro-liberty and small government philosophy on virtually everything, education, the economy, regulation, taxes, property rights, free markets, individual freedoms, you name it, is exactly what we need more of in this country. We also need it at every level, federal, state, and local, maximizing freedom and minimizing government wherever possible. Most Republicans at any level will agree, in theory, that we need a greater amount of fiscal responsibility and fewer politicians trying to run our lives. But 9 times out of 10, Republicans are just as much a part of the problem as anyone else. Believe me, I'm surrounded by them in Washington every day. Very few are serious about the ideas of liberty. Glenn Jacobs is one of these few. Prologue. In October 2018, I boarded a private charter jet at McGee-Tyson Airport, just south of Knoxville, bound for Seattle. The previous month, I had assumed office as the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee. But that night, I would make a surprise appearance on Monday Night Raw, where Undertaker and I would close the show by chokeslamming Shawn Michaels and Triple H. The crowd went absolutely bonkers. I would return home in the same private jet, arriving at 4 a.m. the next day to prepare for a mayoral press conference about an important lawsuit concerning Knox County. WWE had hired the jet so that I could make it back home in time for my day job. Just your typical day at the office, right? As I sat waiting on the plane, I had to smile. I even shook my head, amazed at the whole situation. What life was this? Who am I? How did I get so lucky? How in the world did I get here? 30 years before, in 1988, I was an injured football player, worried about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. For a time, I was genuinely clueless, scared even, about what might come next. Such is the case for many young people starting out. Yet here I was, a globally known superstar for the biggest pro wrestling company on the planet, WWE, and I had also just become mayor of the 3rd largest county in the state, with nearly 500,000 residents. On paper, all of this seemed completely insane. Anyone would have felt blessed to have just one of these jobs. Yet here I was doing both of them on the same day. And they go hand in hand. For over 2 decades, WWE has given me a global platform to entertain and make people happy. The resulting fame, in turn, has allowed me to pursue my passion for freedom and liberty and working to make my home of Knox County, Tennessee, a better place. Kane has always been an outcast or loner, someone who walks to the beat of his own drum. Similarly, Glenn Jacobs, the man, became mayor precisely because I'm not a politician. I'm different. From the moment I stepped into the political arena, I was looked at with skepticism and curiosity by nearly all the professional politicians and so-called experts. Few thought back in 1997 that Kane, the brother of Undertaker, was a character that would stick around for long. But here I was, still going strong after 20 plus years. Few thought that a nearly 7-foot tall WWE superstar could ever be taken seriously as a political candidate. And yet I shocked my county, state, and the world by winning my race for mayor. Few would have ever thought. But I had learned a long time before then that what other people think about you isn't nearly as important as what you believe about yourself. Chapter 1: Raising Kane. When I was 8 years old and living on our family's small farm in northeastern Missouri, Baron von Raschke scared me so badly that I turned off the TV. Once a month, my family would travel to my grandmother's house outside St. Louis. The highlight of the trip was sitting cross-legged in front of my grandma's TV on Saturday morning and watching Wrestling at the Chase, which was then one of the country's premier professional wrestling shows. Wrestling at the Chase featured some of the biggest stars in the sport, including Harley Race, Ric Flair, and the Von Erich family. But it was Raschke, a villainous German whose bald head and snarling demeanor bore a passing resemblance to Freddy Krueger, who made an indelible imprint on my young psyche. Little did I know then that professional wrestling, which would evolve into what we know today as sports entertainment, would play such an integral role in my life. And like Raschke, I would find most of my success as a vicious heel who scared people half to death. Hailing from Madrid, Spain. April 26, 1967 was an uneventful day in the history of Torrejon Air Base in Madrid, Spain. But it was a momentous day for me as United States Air Force Master Sergeant George Jacobs and his wife Joan welcomed their bouncing baby boy, Glenn Thomas Jacobs, into the world. My mom and dad had both grown up in West Alton, Missouri, a small town of a few hundred people right outside St. Louis. While I have some English and Dutch ancestors, I come from mostly German stock. In fact, my mother's maiden name is Riekman. Before moving to America, it was pronounced Reichman, about as German sounding as you can get. After coming to the United States, the family Americanized it to Riekman. My mother's family farmed in the Missouri Bottoms area of the Mississippi River floodplain, some of the most fertile soil in the country. My dad's father was a carpenter and a veteran of World War I who was awarded a Purple Heart and a Silver Star fighting on the Western Front. Mom and Dad got married shortly after high school. By this time, Dad had already enlisted in the Navy. He served in the Navy for 10 years, seeing action during the Korean War on the aircraft carrier USS Antietam. He later switched services to the Air Force. His 11 years in the United States Air Force included a stint in Vietnam. As a loadmaster, Dad was in charge of weight and balance calculations on the big planes, like the Air Force's gigantic Lockheed C-130 Hercules, which was designed to transport troops and cargo. He gave the approval for a flight to take off, one of the rare instances where an enlisted man could overrule a general. Upon entering the world, I joined my sister Becky, who was then 10, and my brother Brian, 8. I've often wondered why I came so long after my siblings, and if I was an unexpected accident or a pleasant surprise, or both. My father is on record as saying that I was the only planned baby, but I think he says that just to make me feel better. Becky, Brian, and I. Other than being tall and kind of looking alike, Becky, Brian, and I are about as diverse as you can be. Becky definitely got the brains in the family. She worked for a while at NASA, then earned her PhD in history. Today, she is a professor at a community college in Oklahoma. Brian is a gifted mechanic. For as long as I can remember, he has been taking apart, fixing, and putting back together anything that has moving parts. I was the family athlete, although it took a while for my talents to manifest. Unlike Becky and Brian, I never experienced the military lifestyle, moving around every year or so, that many kids do. About a year after I was born, we came back to the United States. 3 years later, Dad retired from the Air Force. We settled on a small farm in northeast Missouri, about 20 minutes from the town of Bowling Green, Missouri. We lived about a mile from an unincorporated hamlet called Estes. You've probably heard about towns that only have one stoplight. Estes had just one stop sign. The main attraction in Estes, in fact the only attraction, was the general store. Occasionally, I would walk down the country highway with Becky or Brian to get a Coke and listen and watch as the old-timers chewed the fat and, of course, tobacco. The sodas cost a nickel each, and you open them with the bottle opener screwed into the side of an ice-filled metal box, which acted as the cooler. On a hot Missouri summer day, those ice-cold Coca-Colas were almost as good as the signature lemon meringue pies at the Presbyterian Church's Ladies Auxiliary Club's bake sales. I clearly had my priorities straight as a kid. In the middle of our little farm sat a boulder, which became the source of a family controversy. This rock, a large reddish hunk about 3 feet around, nestled peacefully in a meadow, was completely out of place and inconsistent with the rest of the geology of the place. Mom claimed that it was a meteorite and wanted to send a sample to the University of Missouri so that geologists there could examine it. Looking back now, it's obvious that a meteorite that size would have created a massive crater. But at the time, the idea of an extraterrestrial object in our backyard was exciting to me, which may explain my later fleeting fascination with UFOs and all things outer space. Growing up on a farm was not really the bucolic, romanticized life that you read about in novels. For instance, consider the smells. They're not exactly fragrant. Across the road from our house was a large hog farm. When the wind blew the right way, we relaxed on the porch and enjoyed the pleasant evenings. But when the breeze shifted, which it often did within a couple of minutes, the clean country air was replaced by the stench of manure from hundreds of hogs. The WCW pay-per-view, Hog Wild, was sweet and genteel compared to our swine experience. On our farm, we raised a few cattle and some hogs. One of my earliest memories was waking early in the morning to accompany Dad to the barn. One of our sows had given birth to a litter of piglets. Dad was making sure that she didn't roll over on them and accidentally kill them. Another time, we discovered a bloated cow in our cornfield. She had fallen onto her side and couldn't get back up. I watched in fascination and horror as my parents inserted a corkscrew-shaped trocar between the poor beast's ribs to relieve the pent-up gas. I was completely mortified. Luckily, the cow survived and was soon back to normal. As for me, well, there are some things you just can't unsee. By the time I was in 3rd grade, Becky and Brian had both moved out of the house. Becky had graduated high school and was attending the University of Missouri at Columbia. She stayed there only a year, though. Mizzou was a big school and too impersonal for her. She ended up being accepted into a work-study program at NASA's Johnson Space Center and moved to Houston, where she attended the University of Houston, Clear Lake. Eventually, she would earn a bachelor's degree in mathematics, then another undergraduate degree in archaeology, then a PhD in history. To say she's accomplished is an understatement. Brian had gone to live with Grandma near St. Louis so that he could attend a vocational school and study auto mechanics. He was always so good with his hands, a natural talent. From something as small as a watch to a piece of heavy machinery, if it has moving parts, Brian can fix it. I couldn't have asked for a better brother and sister. baseball, basketball, and Hulk Hogan. After Becky and Brian left home, I essentially became an only child. Granted, because of our age differences, it wasn't like we had been playmates, but I enjoyed their company, especially Becky's. I remember a Halloween party Becky hosted at our house for some of her friends. At the time, the movie Billy Jack was a hit. We will never again see so many barefooted teenagers wearing flat-brimmed, round-domed cowboy hats in one place as were at our house that night. Growing up alone had its advantages. I think that it really helped enrich my imagination. My parents were always big readers, and I would often immerse myself in books to pass the time. My favorites were Westerns by Louis L'Amour. I also learned that I was pretty good company and felt comfortable in my own skin. Despite having pursued careers that have placed me in the public eye, I am very much an introvert and would rather read a book at home than socialize out in the town. I'm convinced that my childhood has a lot to do with that. Around my 4th grade year, my family moved about an hour away to another small farm near a town of about 300 residents called Frankfort. Halloween night in Frankfort was reminiscent of Devil's Night in the movie The Crow. For years, unruly folks dragged junk cars to the middle of Main Street and set them on fire. Luckily, that was the most exciting thing to happen in town, except possibly when Frankfort native P.J. Lansing appeared as Playboy magazine's Playmate of the Month in February 1972. Nevertheless, if Lansing's centerfold had caused any buzz in Frankfort, it had long since dissipated by the time we arrived, about 5 years later. Since I was new at school, I certainly wasn't the most popular kid. Add to that my height and social and physical awkwardness, and I often felt that I didn't fit in. I was a naturally good student, not great, but good. From an early age, I was passionate about sports, especially baseball. Growing up near St. Louis, I was a huge Cardinals fan. I fondly remember staying up late during the summer to listen as KMOX's legendary radio duo of Jack Buck and Mike Shannon called a Cardinals West Coast road trip. My dream was to play for the Cardinals. I recall setting up an imaginary scenario in which it was the bottom of the 9th inning in the World Series. The Cardinals were down by 3 runs, and the bases were loaded with 2 outs. With the image firmly in my mind, I tossed a rock into the air and swung at it with a stick. Unfortunately, I was a pretty horrible baseball player. I didn't hit that rock very often. I don't think I even had a hit in my entire Little League baseball career. Because of my height, I was a much better basketball player. But until my body matured, my dreams of playing professional sports were just that, dreams. I kept trying though, playing football and basketball in middle school. By 8th grade, I was 6 feet 4 inches tall and still growing. Knowing my brother Brian was close to 6'8", I figured basketball was my best bet and decided to concentrate on that. I was a pretty good basketball player and kept getting better as I grew into my body. By the time I was a senior in high school, I was being recruited by a number of colleges, including some Division I schools. I had also become a pretty decent student by that time, graduating in 1985 from Bowling Green High School, the county's consolidated high school, in the top 10% of my class. I am totally proud to be a child of the 80s. My teenage years were dominated by early home video game systems like the Atari 2600, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Michael J. Fox, iconic feuds like the one between Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, and TV shows like The Dukes of Hazzard and The A-Team. But most of all, I was smitten by music videos on MTV. Like millions of other teenagers, I'd race home or to a friend's house after school to watch the latest videos on the relatively new cable music channel. And I wasn't the only one who took note of the rise of MTV. Much of the success of WWE in the 1980s can be traced to the decision by WWE Chairman and CEO Vince McMahon to partner with and promote artists like Cyndi Lauper. And just as MTV was changing entertainment, a blonde, bulging behemoth named Hulk Hogan was changing professional wrestling. Tanned and muscular, Hogan looked nothing like the pro wrestlers I remembered from my childhood. He was a superhero come to life. I'll never forget watching Hogan slam Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3. I'd injured my ankle playing basketball and was in a hospital bed when the clip played on the syndicated show, The George Michael Sports Machine. Nevertheless, my interest in pro wrestling was still just as a casual fan. I'd earned a basketball scholarship to attend Quincy College, now Quincy University, in Illinois, about an hour's drive north of Frankfort. After a year and a half there, I became frustrated with my role on the team and transferred to Northeast Missouri State University, NEMO, in Kirksville, less than 2 hours from Frankfort. Like many young people, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. I'd started my college career as a computer science major, but I just wasn't that adept at it. Thinking that I might like to teach, I switched my major to English. At NEMO, they were introducing a program for education majors, and I got caught in the transition. So while I would eventually earn a BA in English, I would graduate a couple hours short of my teaching certification. When I graduated high school, I only weighed about 230 pounds. That's pretty slim on a 6'8" frame. I'd only played basketball and had never really lifted weights. All that changed when I began my college career. I'll be practicing with the Chicago Bears. I spent the summer between my senior year in high school and my freshman year in college with Becky in Houston, where I joined the local Gold's Gym. Over the next couple of months, I put on 20 pounds of muscle. In college, my coaches encouraged me to lift, and I loved it. Lifting weights became one of my pastimes. By senior year, I weighed about 285 pounds. Talk about large and in charge. By then, I had played 4 years of basketball. But as I bulked up, the football coach began talking to me more and more about joining his team, something I had never considered before. I had 1 year of eligibility left if I decided to switch from basketball to football. With a few hours left to get my degree and my only prospects of playing basketball professionally in question, I decided, what the heck? I donned a helmet and pads. I discovered that my body was made for football. As I continued to lift weights and eat a lot, I eventually tipped the scales at 320 pounds. Playing basketball all those years had helped me retain my athleticism. Being a Division II school, we rarely had NFL scouts watching our practices, but they showed up to watch me. I was receiving letters of interest from the Dallas Cowboys and other NFL teams. ESPN's NFL draft analyst, Mel Kiper, had a list of potential picks to move up to the pros, and I was ranked at number 25. I hadn't played football since the 8th grade. But as so often happens, life had different plans for me. It was the first practice of our first game week of the season. Practice was essentially over. Given the day's high heat index, we weren't running sprints or doing any conditioning. By now, the team had the playbook down pat, so the last 15 minutes of practice was devoted to going through some trick plays. We were walking through the plays at 3/4 speed, no contact, and had removed our helmets and shoulder pads. This particular play was a wide receiver reverse. I was playing right offensive tackle, and the play was coming to my side. The quarterback would fake a handoff to the running back on a play to the opposite side, and then make the handoff to a wideout who was running my way. My job was to allow the opposing defensive end or outside linebacker to get around me. Then, as he realizes his mistake and turns to pursue the wide receiver, clean his clock. The center hiked the ball and the play began to develop. I allowed the linebacker to get past me, but then a strange thing happened as I pivoted. Somehow, I was on my back on the ground. Seriously, I had no idea what had happened. 1 second I was on my feet. The next, I was on my back. No one had hit me. I just fell. Then, as I got back up to my feet, my left knee buckled and I fell again. This time when I tried to get up, I couldn't put any weight on that knee. There was no pain. The knee just wasn't stable enough to hold me upright. By now, the whole team had gathered around to see what was up. Finally, the training staff came over to look at me. After discovering that moving my knee in a couple of different directions caused some discomfort, they helped me off the field and into the training room. I got undressed and they wrapped ice on my knee. I showered, took the ice off, and went home on crutches with my knee in a splint. By now, the knee had become tender and was beginning to swell. When I woke up the next day, my left knee was howling with pain and continuing to swell. Our head trainer, Clint Thompson, who incidentally was the head trainer at Michigan State University the year they won a national championship with Magic Johnson, thought that I had torn my anterior cruciate ligament, ACL. My parents drove to Kirksville, picked me up, and took me to the University of Missouri-Columbia for an exploratory arthroscopic procedure. The surgery confirmed Clint's diagnosis. I had suffered a partial tear of my ACL and damaged the meniscus in my left knee. Since I didn't have the medical hardship waiver called a medical red shirt, I had no choice but to play that season or end my career without having played a single college game. So I worked hard at rehab and was back on the field after 6 weeks. Unfortunately, I just wasn't the player that I had been before the injury. I didn't have the explosiveness or the agility that I had possessed previously. I also guarded my knee. For an offensive lineman, it's all about footwork. Depending on which way the play is going, you have to take certain steps in a certain way. If you don't, you will never make the play. After the injury, I had a lot of trouble leading with my left foot. Often it was an unconscious fear. I was gun-shy about using that leg. Despite my struggles, the team had an excellent year. We ended up with a 9-2 record, losing in the National Division II playoffs. Of course, I didn't contribute much, if at all, to that success, but it was a memorable season nonetheless. Though I still didn't give up on my dream, my prospects appeared much dimmer now. I graduated in the winter semester of 1990 and moved back home. I got a job working in a group home for individuals with special needs, but I kept training hard, hoping that I could get a shot in the NFL. I wasn't invited to the NFL Scouting Combine, the annual week-long showcase in Indianapolis for college athletes, but I did work out with a couple of teams. When draft day came, I was pretty excited. My agent told me that a few teams were willing to take a chance on me, and I could expect to be drafted in the later rounds. That didn't happen. I can't say that I was shocked by this turn of events. After all, here I was, a basketball player turned football player who had minimal experience playing at a small school and had suffered a severe knee injury less than a year before. Not exactly a recipe for success as an NFL prospect. However, I was elated when a few days later, my agent told me that the Chicago Bears had offered me a contract as an undrafted free agent. It even included a $5,000 signing bonus. A couple of weeks later, I flew from Lambert International Airport in St. Louis to Chicago O'Hare International Airport, where a car picked me up and whisked me off to the Bears training facility in Lake Forest, Illinois. There, all the rookies went through a battery of physicals, everything from vision tests to hearing tests to, of course, orthopedic tests. At the end of the day, we met with our position coaches who told us what to expect the next day at the minicamp. I went to bed that night on cloud 9. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll be practicing with the Chicago Bears. The next morning, a bus carried the rookies who were staying in the hotel to the Bears training facility. Then a funny thing happened. While all the other potential Bears exited the bus and headed over to the field house, a Bears representative escorted another player and me to a nearby office building. We were ushered into the office of the Director of Player Personnel, where we were informed that each of us had an injury that precluded us from playing for the Chicago Bears. "Sorry, guys," he told us in a sympathetic voice. "We just can't take a chance on you." From there, the car took me back to the airport and I caught a flight home. The whole experience had lasted just over 24 hours. I was devastated. Coming back from an injury like the one I had suffered had been no small feat. Rehab had been physically painful and emotionally draining. Many times throughout the process, I had wanted to give up. So often it felt too hard and not worth it. Time and again, I had talked myself off the figurative ledge and told myself I could make it through another day, that it was worth it, that I owed it to myself to give it my best. Cliches, I know, but still true. In the end, all that work and effort had been a waste. At least that's what I told myself. For a couple of weeks, I wallowed in self-pity. Looking back, I'm pretty ashamed of that. At the same time, I was still a kid, and my life's dream had been viciously snatched away from me just when it seemed like I was on the verge of fulfilling it. Finally, I decided that I needed to get on with my life. There was still a slim chance that I could end up in the NFL via the newly formed World League of American Football, the NFL's nascent minor league. So I got back into the gym and started training again the only way that I knew how, hard and heavy. I've heard it said that in life, when one door closes, another one opens. That's not exactly what happens, though. It's not nearly that sanitary or peaceful. The door slams violently just when you are about to step through. It knocks you down, leaves you bloodied and broken and shattered. Sometimes the hardest thing that you ever do is to pick up the pieces and crawl back to your feet. But when you do, you realize that these other doors have been there all along. You just never saw them before. They don't just pop open. You have to force them open through determination and hard work. Deep down, I knew that my chances of playing in the NFL were as good as dead. But I also knew that there were only a few individuals on the planet who were as tall and muscular as I was, who were as physically impressive and imposing as I was, who possessed the innate athleticism that I had for someone my size. It all clicked one evening when I was watching WWE primetime wrestling with my buddy Mark Morton at his house in nearby Louisiana, Missouri. Mark was a huge WWE fan and joked that he and I should give professional wrestling a try. In my mind, I suddenly saw a door that I'd never considered before. The question was, how would I open it? Chapter 2, Get in the Ring. Born in a barn. Kersmack! My forearm crashed down on a Mark's back with a thunderous slap. Man, you're killing him, said my trainer TC Rocannon, aka the Nightmaster. I couldn't get it through my head that TC was telling me to pause with my hand raised over my head for dramatic effect before I unleashed the blow. I thought he meant I should just hit Mark harder. Luckily, Mark was a good sport. Plus, I probably owed him a few anyway. My career in sports entertainment started from very humble beginnings. In fact, these first lessons were actually in a ring that TC had set up in the hayloft over his barn. Once a week, Mark and I would make the hour-long trip to TC's farm close to Kingdom City, Missouri. There we learned some rudimentary skills, like how to take a bump, which is wrestling parlance for getting knocked to the mat in a way that looks violent but causes the body the least amount of harm. We also learned how to give and take moves, pantomime punches, kicks, and other strikes, and talked a little about how to develop a persona. Mark and I had been directed to TC after attending a small independent wrestling show. There, we saw local stars like the Shadow Warriors, Matt Michaels, and Lunatic Max. The featured match was an over-the-top rope battle royal. I was mesmerized as I watched the participants fly over the top rope and hit the ground with a sickening slap. How did that not kill these guys? After the show, we spoke with the promoter, Frank Root. Frank gave us TC's number and told us to call him. The training wasn't free. TC charged each of us $50 per lesson. At the time, I was working at the group home for people with special needs, and that was a pretty hefty sum for me. But I was hooked and figured that I might have a future in this business. After a few months, I had my first match. It was in front of around 300 people in the ballroom of the Stegton Regency Banquet Center in St. Charles, Missouri, just outside of St. Louis. I wore tights that my mom had made for me. I always thought the name Angus was cool, so I assumed the ring moniker Angus King from Glasgow, Scotland. My opponent was my trainer, the Nightmaster. As I made my way to the ring, I recognized a guy from the audience whom I knew from the area's Bally's Total Fitness Club, where I had worked as a personal trainer. He stood up and cheered for me, but being a heel, as we call the bad guy in wrestling lingo, I told him to shut up. He quickly sat down with a disappointed look on his face. During the match, the Nightmaster used a DDT, a move in which a wrestler holds the opponent in an inverted headlock, then falls down or backward, slamming the opponent's head into the mat. Nightmaster won, but at least I had one under my belt. Even at this basement level of wrestling, politics were part of the business. TC and Frank had a falling out. It became clear that if I worked for Frank, TC wasn't going to train me. Frank, on the other hand, promoted about 4 or 5 shows a month. Faced with the decision between training with TC in a hayloft or appearing in matches in front of an audience, I chose the latter. My training consisted of working out in the ring before the shows. I should qualify what I mean by shows. Usually, we put up the ring in a National Guard armory or other small venue. Crowds varied from 24 people to a few hundred. One of my favorite venues was the National Guard Armory in Hannibal. It was close to home, and because Mark and I helped promote the events, we always drew a strong crowd. On the business side, sports entertainment is just like any other industry. Success is all about relationships and networking. As I worked and gained experience, I also met people who got me booked in other promotions. At that point in my career, building in-ring experience was imperative. My dilemma was where to train. Performing in matches once a week or so was great, but I needed more formal training. I asked around and learned that Jeff Jarrett was holding classes on Saturday mornings at a gym near Nashville. Jeff and his dad, Jerry Jarrett, along with the legendary Jerry the King Lawler, owned the Memphis-based United States Wrestling Association, USWA, whose productions were a big step up from what I was doing. So for the next month or so, I drove the 5 hours to Nashville every weekend to train with about 15 others in the class. While working with Jeff was definitely a step up in my pro wrestling education, I knew that I'd have to devote more than 1 day a week to training. The problem was that I had no options in my area. However, getting in front of Jeff did help me establish a relationship with USWA management, which led to my first appearance on TV. One afternoon after work, I arrived home to a message from Jerry Lawler asking that I call him. Butterflies filled my stomach. I anxiously thought, this is the break I've been waiting for. Well, not quite. This big break was as generic and bland as it gets. Jerry told me that he wanted me to don a mask and team with another big guy from Southern Missouri and portray Russian wrestling champions, complete with gold medals. So there I was, the following Saturday morning in the Channel 5 studios in Memphis, proudly representing the USSR, a country that had ceased to exist the year before. The Russian wrestling champions had a squash match on TV against a local tag team that everyone knew didn't stand a chance. A squash match, in wrestling jargon, means a one-sided match where one side overwhelmingly dominates the other. That Monday, we lost to the team of Reno Riggins and Dutch Mantel. Today, WWE fans know Mantel as Zeb Coulter, who would help me get a number of my early breaks. The following Saturday, we lost on TV and the team disbanded, much like our home country, the USSR. Memphis wrestling has always been known for its outlandish characters and storylines. So I wasn't surprised when I received a call around Christmas from Kevin Lawler, one of Jerry's sons. Kevin had an idea for a seasonal character, the Christmas creature. That's right, the Christmas creature. Like his father, Kevin was a talented artist. He sent me a rendering. The picture looked like a cross between a Christmas tree and Swamp Thing. It was all kinds of ridiculous, but it gave me the chance to wrestle against Jerry Lawler, which I knew was a big step in the right direction. A couple of days later, my mom was back at it, this time making a green full bodysuit, complete with garland, Christmas ornaments, and working Christmas tree lights. The outfit was ahead of its time, with the battery pack to power the miniature light bulbs embedded in the costume. Needless to say, once the holiday season was over, so was the Christmas creature. By now, I was frustrated with my progress, or lack thereof, in the pro wrestling business. My development was stymied by the lack of places to train and my sporadic work schedule. I was so desperate to get bookings that I traveled once to the Dominican Republic for a weekend at my own expense to wrestle a match. That quick trip was set up by a promoter from Iowa who had connections with Jack Venano, the biggest name in Dominican Republic wrestling history. I'll never forget seeing pictures on Venano's office wall of a match between him and Ric Flair in 1982. The photographs featured Venano holding the National Wrestling Alliance, NWA, World Heavyweight Championship above his head. Jack Venano, NWA World Champion? Well, not quite. His win was never officially recognized by the NWA. That's because it was never supposed to happen. Many wrestling fans today know the backstory of this almost mythical match. At its crescendo, it appeared Venano had defeated Rick and won the championship. However, the time limit had passed, which meant Rick retained the title. When the match finished and Venano was awarded the title, the crowd went crazy, and Rick knew that he'd never get out of there alive if the decision were reversed. He decided that discretion was the better part of valor that particular night, and rather than risk a riot, he let Venano win. Although many fans have heard this story, I got to see proof right there on the walls of Jack Venano's office. Real Training with the Professor, the Great Malenko. After feeling like I had been spinning my wheels for months, I came to the conclusion that if I was going to be serious about sports entertainment, I would need to make some serious changes. That would begin with receiving real training. After doing some research on pro wrestling schools, I decided to call Malenko's Pro Wrestling Academy in Tampa, Florida, owned and operated by Professor Boris Malenko, who had achieved significant success in the 1960s and 1970s. Many fans today are familiar with his talented son, Dean Malenko, whose runs in both WCW and WWE had a big impact. After talking with the good professor, known in civilian life as Larry Simon, I made up my mind. I was going to Tampa to study wrestling full-time. I borrowed $1,000 from my parents, loaded my belongings into my blue Dodge Diplomat, prayed that the car would make the 16-hour trip, and drove off. When I arrived in Tampa, I met Larry. Everyone who achieves success in anything has help along the way. I've been very fortunate in that respect. Larry helped me as much as anyone. He was one of the kindest and most good-hearted people I have ever met. Larry took me into his home, allowing me to rent a bedroom for a very modest price. I think it was $50 per week. Eventually, that rent dropped to zero. Larry was a source of wisdom and insight. I couldn't have made a better choice. My time with him would prove to be invaluable. Plus, I was living in beautiful Tampa, just minutes from the beach. At the school, which was located in a business park, I trained 5 days a week with other students from Australia, Britain, and Japan. Larry rented an apartment in the back of the park to his Japanese students. I hit it off with them and spent time driving with them, running errands around town. Unfortunately, Larry was not in good health. His sons, Dean and Jody, were busy with their own careers. Today, Dean is still involved with wrestling and Jody is a pharmacist. They came by occasionally, but most of the day-to-day operations were run by Rico Federico, who worked in WCW and WWE, with Larry providing supervision. At Malenko School, we learned more than professional style wrestling. Larry was longtime friends with Karl Gotch, one of the most legendary grappling and submission practitioners in the history of our business. To this day, when people think of submission wrestling, they usually think first of Gotch. He had such an influence on pro wrestling in Japan in the 1950s and 1960s that he is still known there as the god of wrestling. Because Jody had trained under Gotch, Gotch would sometimes pop into the school. As a result, there was a strong influence of submission or shoot-style wrestling at Malenko School. I was finally getting the fundamentals I had lacked from some of the best our business had ever seen. Those skills certainly came in handy for the next step in my career. Japan and a bear. My first real job in the business was not in traditional professional wrestling, but in shoot-style wrestling with the Japanese promotion company Fujiwara Gumi. It was owned by Yoshiaki Fujiwara, who was considered one of Gotch's best students. Unlike traditional pro wrestling, which is based around fast-paced action and drama, shoot style emphasizes pure grappling. In Fujiwara Gumi, you wouldn't see any punches or kicks or the performers being thrown into the ropes. The action was on the mat, with the wrestlers exchanging submission holds along with the occasional judo throw or suplex. Fujiwara paid me $1,000 a match. That was a godsend at the time. I was working odd jobs to get by during my training, and the money really helped. Fujiwara would fly a few of us from Tampa to Tokyo a few days early, and we'd train at his dojo in preparation for the matches. Japan was a culture shock for me. One of the things I remember most was that I had to put 100 yen, nearly $1, into a vending machine every hour to watch the hotel TVs. I didn't care to watch it because all the programming was in Japanese. I was far more interested in training in the dojo and learning from a legend like Yoshiaki Fujiwara. Fujiwara Gumi held its matches in the world-famous Corrigan Hall, which is part of the legendary Tokyo Dome, the Tokyo Big Egg. I had a blast at these shows. Unlike audiences elsewhere, the Japanese treat combat arts more like a sporting event to be observed and appreciated. The crowd is often silent, focused on watching the action. To the uninitiated, particularly the wrestlers, this can be unnerving. But once you begin to understand their unique culture with respect to wrestling, you realize the Japanese are just honoring your work. With my size and strength, and after training with Jody Simon, I could hold my own in the ring against most competition. But what I really enjoyed during that time was watching the other matches. Fujiwara Gumi was a true mixed martial arts promotion in that they pitted athletes from different disciplines against one another. The contrast in styles was fascinating, especially when the Thai kickboxers fought the wrestlers. The kickboxers' main offense was to take out the wrestlers' legs with brutal kicks to the outer thighs. Being a grappler myself, I always look forward to the wrestler weathering the storm, shooting inside his opponent's defenses, and taking him to the ground, where the now defenseless kickboxer was quickly forced to submit, unless he could scamper to the ropes to break the hold. It was captivating. Japan is a school unto itself. Every WWE superstar I've met who has been lucky enough to visit Japan has told me they appreciated their time there and benefited from it. Around the holidays, I'd gone back home to visit my folks and friends when I got a phone call from Fujiwara that led to one of the most bizarre things I've ever been involved with in sports entertainment, which, when you think about it, is a pretty amazing statement coming from Kane. Fujiwara was filming a segment for a variety show in Japan. It consisted of footage of him traveling to Canada to train and wrestle a bear. You heard that right, a bear. This wasn't the era of P.T. Barnum and circus sideshow wrestling. It was the 1990s. Since I was the biggest guy they knew, they asked if I could go to Toronto for a couple of days to be Fujiwara's training partner. In other words, I was going to be the Bears' stunt double. I'd had some interesting journeys in my life at this point, even mixing it up once with some future Chicago Bears. But an actual bear? Different story. The next thing I knew, I was on a flight to Canada. My part was supposed to be easy. Just an hour or so of wrestling with Fujiwara in a training facility. Easy enough, right? Wrong. Everything went downhill from there. Evidently, the show's producers forgot that bears hibernate in the winter. That applies to all bears. Even the former circus performer who had been trained to dance with his human opponents and had been called out of retirement on an exotic animal farm for the scene. When it came time for them to shoot the fight scene, the bear was having none of it. He hissed and lunged at Fujiwara before dispatching him with a shoulder tackle that sent my mentor flying head over heels. It was terrible. It's on YouTube at the time of this writing. I got a chuckle out of it going back to watch while writing this chapter. I've seen worse matches, but not many. Puerto Rico. When I finally got back to Tampa, I received a call from Dutch Mantell. As I mentioned earlier, Dutch was instrumental in helping me early in my career. I'd first met him in Memphis while working for Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett, then ran into him again at an independent show in Illinois where we exchanged phone numbers. Dutch had just taken over booking for the Puerto Rico territory and wanted me to travel to the island to work for him. I was thrilled. These would not be sporadic one-off shows. I would finally have the chance to work full time. Larry Simon was a lot less excited than I was. There's an old saying in wrestling about promoters. There are two kinds, bad and worse. The Puerto Rico promotion, owned by island legend Carlos Colon, had a reputation as the latter. That reputation stemmed, rightfully so, from the Bruiser Brody incident just a few years prior. Brody, who had been a top wrestler during the 1980s, was allegedly murdered by another wrestler after a show in 1988, stabbed in the locker room shower. Larry had good reason to be concerned that I would be used and abused in Puerto Rico. But despite Larry's concerns, I knew that I had to take the risk. Work was still hard to find, and the opportunity to hone my craft as part of a full-time job was something that I couldn't pass up. Fortunately, it turned out to be a great decision. Carlos was always fair to me, and my time on the island proved rewarding. That said, I was nervous as I got on the plane in Orlando. Here I was, a Midwestern farm boy headed to a Caribbean island with literally no return ticket and no money. My only contact was a guy I hardly knew. Talk about a roll of the dice. Things didn't start so well. Dutch had told me someone would meet me at the airport to pick me up. That didn't happen. No one was there. I found a payphone and called Dutch. He didn't seem surprised and told me to take a cab to his apartment. Luckily, his place wasn't far from the airport, so the cab fare was only a few dollars. I made my way up to Dutch's apartment, dragging my bags with me, and knocked on the door. An enormous Samoan, his face obscured by his long, wet, curly black hair, opened the door and scowled at me. My greeter was wearing nothing but a lava, the traditional skirt worn by many Polynesians, and he filled the entire doorway. Behind him, a shirtless Dutch Mantel, the man who had talked me into coming to this strange place, the man in whom I had naively placed my trust, the man who had told me he'd take care of me, was standing on a sofa, shaking his fist and screaming obscenities out of a sliding glass window. Welcome to Puerto Rico. I stood there for a moment in stunned silence, taking in the scene. Just as I was about to write this whole episode off as a case of bad judgment and head back to the airport, prepared to swallow my pride and beg mom and dad to buy me a plane ticket home from this nut house, I saw a broad grin spread across the Samoan's face. He extended his hand to shake mine. "Hey, brother, I'm Lloyd," he said warmly. "Sorry, I was just getting out of the shower. Come on in." As I entered the room, a transformed Dutch jumped off the couch and came over to greet me. He could tell by my expression that I had been caught off guard by the previous scene. I didn't know then that Lloyd was part of the famous Samoan Anawati family that has produced many WWE superstars. I also didn't know Dutch was just being in character. He laughed and explained to me that the building next door had been undergoing construction for some time and that the workers had recognized him, asleep on the couch under a picture window, as the dastardly El Sucio, his television character. Every morning at 6, when the workers began, they awakened Dutch with taunts. Dutch's explanation made all the sense in the world. I immediately felt better. When I asked him later why he didn't just close the window and draw the curtains, he made up some story about having claustrophobia. I didn't buy it. I think he just liked being a heel and enjoyed his interaction with his nemesis across the way. Puerto Rico was my first real job in the business, and it proved integral to my development as a wrestler. In Japan, I had worn black trunks, pads, and amateur wrestling shoes and wrestled under my real name. But in Puerto Rico, I wore a hockey mask embossed with a red skull and wrestled as Doomsday, an homage to the comic book supervillain who killed Superman. Perhaps most importantly, my creative energies were unleashed in Puerto Rico for the first time. I was allowed to use my imagination and portray a character. I loved it. To this day, my favorite thing about sports entertainment is its creative aspect. Unlike in other performance arts, in sports entertainment, you have the latitude to make a character truly yours. There are few constraints or restrictions. From Ric Flair to Dusty Rhodes to Stone Cold Steve Austin to Undertaker, success is not dependent only on one's ability in the ring and on the mic, but also on one's ability to bring to life a character that the audience can relate to, someone they either love or they love to hate. There's a beauty and satisfaction to this known only to my colleagues and few other entertainers. In Puerto Rico, we worked 5 days a week, usually Wednesday through Sunday. Unlike Memphis, there were no studio matches. On Wednesday mornings, we tape interviews and promos at the company headquarters. Saturday night was always a big show, and matches from that night were shown on TV the next morning. I was making a meager living doing what I loved, and our apartment was a few feet from the Caribbean Ocean. Life was good. The fans in Puerto Rico took their wrestling seriously. At times, a little too seriously. One night at a show, I exited the ring to interact with the fans. An older gentleman pulled out a pocket knife and barreled toward the security barrier. I hightailed it back to the safety of the squared circle. On another occasion, I witnessed a full-scale riot. Dutch did a masterful job of booking and storytelling for Carlos's company. Relying on the tried and true strategy of uniting his heels into a loose faction or stable, Dutch's business prospered, even as he established himself as the most despised person on the island. Unfortunately, that position came with legitimate risks. The hot babyface, good guy wrestler, at the time was Hurricane Castillo Jr., who later competed in WWE as a member of the Hispanic stable Los Boricuas. A longtime heel, Hurricane had recently turned babyface, but was not yet accepted in that locker room. You must understand that in our business, a wrestler without a locker room is like a man without a country. Hurricane was taking on Dutch's entire stable alone, which made him wildly popular with the fans. It was Saturday night in the Puerto Rican town of Trujillo Alto. The main event was Dutch versus Ray Gonzalez, also a popular young babyface, with Dutch's manager, Joe Don Smith. Smith was locked in a steel cell at ringside. In attendance was a standing room only crowd of over 3,500. The place was packed and electric. As we pulled into the parking lot, which was already full a couple of hours before the show, Dutch whispered softly to himself, "I got a bad feeling about this." I guess it was a premonition. The storyline to that point was that Dutch had severely beaten and injured Castillo, which explained why Hurricane wasn't at the show. The main event rolled around, and Dutch took a beating from Ray before Joe Don was able to slip Dutch some brass knuckles between the bars of his cage. Dutch hit Ray with the brass knuckles to win the match. Dutch then unlocked Joe Don's cage, and the two of them put the boots to Ray. That's when Hurricane Castillo made a surprise entrance and came to Ray's rescue. The roof blew off the place. Castillo blew through Joe Don Smith and snatched Dutch. The crowd had been hoping for this moment all night. The place went bonkers when Castillo started to pummel Dutch. Every time he punched Dutch, the audience cheered. Fans began converging on the ring, blocking the aisles and escape routes. Just then, Lloyd and another stablemate, Louis Fabiano, hit the ring. Castillo fought them off, but Dutch was able to use the distraction to escape to our locker room. As he made his way back toward the ring, Dutch tripped over some of the fans who were blocking his path. He went face first into the edge of the bleachers, badly cutting himself around the eye. I was watching the entire scene from just outside the locker room and grabbed Dutch to help him back. After getting Dutch back into the locker room, I opened the door to go back out. It was pure chaos. The building was now filled with an angry, unruly mob. Joe Don, Lloyd, and Louie were trapped in the ring, which, at this point, was probably the safest place in the building. The hall outside our locker room was filled with fans who were pushing and shoving the security guards. One of the security guards had his jacket pulled up from the bottom over his head and shoulders, much like you see in a hockey fight. He was fighting a losing battle with the fans trying to disrobe him. I pulled him into the safety of the locker room. Even though he was holding a towel against his bloody eye, Dutch laughed when my only comment about the entire scene engulfing the both of us was, "Wow." Luckily, the police showed up shortly thereafter, and things de-escalated quickly. We took Dutch to the hospital, where he got a couple dozen stitches to sew up the cuts above and below his eye. That event was intense. All in all, that was probably the most exciting night of my career, but not in a good way, nor one that I would ever want to experience again. Still, my overall experience in Puerto Rico was great. I ended up working there for about 9 months. I was gaining experience in the ring while living in the Caribbean. Not a bad deal at all. At one point, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert moved into our apartment. Eddie had worked in promotions around the world as both an in-ring performer and a booker. He was widely acknowledged as one of the great minds in the wrestling business, and I had the good fortune to be around him for a few months. It was in Puerto Rico that I also had my first match with Mick Foley, whose ring name was Cactus Jack, when he traveled to the island for a couple of shows. I can't say enough about him, both as a performer and a person. Life is filled with inflection points, events that may seem insignificant at the time, but change the course of your entire career. One of those moments for me had occurred when I was standing in the doorway of Lloyd Anawai's apartment, watching Dutch scream out the window and wondering what I was doing there. Thank goodness that Lloyd extended his hand and invited me into his home. Otherwise, my life would have never been the same. Smoky Mountain Wrestling. After runs with every baby face on the roster in Puerto Rico, I felt that it was time to take the next step in my nascent career. Dutch agreed and called his old friend Jim Cornette, owner of the Knoxville, Tennessee-based Smoky Mountain Wrestling, SMW. Many fans know that, along with the late Bobby the Brain Heenan, Jimmy is considered one of the greatest managers and minds in the history of professional wrestling. His work with the legendary tag team, the Midnight Express and Mid-South Wrestling, and Jim Crockett Promotions in the 1980s is still talked about today. Needless to say, I was excited by the idea of working for him. Jimmy was intrigued by the idea of a big guy like me working for SMW. Since he was also working with WWE as a creative consultant and managing the tag team, the Heavenly Bodies, Jimmy realized that I was exactly the kind of talent WWE was looking for, and that he could help me through his promotion. Jimmy told me that I would start right after Christmas. In the meantime, Eddie Gilbert had arranged for me to work for Otto Wanz in Germany. Wanz was a significant name in wrestling in Germany and was also famous for having the Guinness World Record for tearing up telephone books. Arnold Schwarzenegger cites Wanz, who was always performing feats of strength, as one of his early influences. Wanz's touring model was different than any others I'd come across. For instance, USWA had a set weekly touring schedule. You'd be in Memphis for TV on Saturday morning, then Nashville that night. Sunday was a small show somewhere, then Monday was Memphis at the Mid-South Coliseum. Tuesday was at the Louisville Gardens, and Wednesday at the Evansville Memorial Coliseum. Smoky Mountain Wrestling taped a month of TV programming at one time in different venues every month and had no set weekly routine. WWE, of course, it's constantly on the road at different arenas all the time. Vince didn't have a TV show. All of his promotion was local. The shows were held at the same venue for about a month, and then the operation moved to the next city for a month. There were other differences as well. Much like boxing, the matches were segmented into rounds, and you could win by knockout. Otto's ring was also as hard as concrete and just as unforgiving, so you didn't see many high-impact moves. I spent the coldest November of my life in Bremen, Germany. Literally. Most of the wrestlers lived out back of the arena in campers. Mine didn't have any heat or a bathroom. I showered and used the toilet in the arena. I'd huddle under the covers at night and hope that I didn't have to use the bathroom before the arena opened in the morning. Nonetheless, working for Otto was a blast. I met folks like the English pro wrestler Tony Sinclair and Dave Fit Finlay, the wrestler and trainer from Northern Ireland. I also formed a tag team with John Layfield, aka Justin Hawk Bradshaw, later known as JBL in WWE. We were called the Zy-Meter Tag Team, which translated to the 6'6" team. We dominated the competition and formed a friendship during our time there that continues to this day. After my run in Germany, I flew back to the United States to spend the holidays with my family before traveling to Knoxville to work with Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I was anxious to begin. Smoky Mountain was truly an all-star promotion, boasting a great talent pool with performers like Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson of the WWE Hall of Fame tag team, the Rock and Roll Express, Tracy Smothers, Tony Anthony, the famous wrestling family, the Armstrongs, which included future WWE star Road Dogg Jesse James, the Heavenly Bodies, Chris Candido along with his manager, Tammy Sitch, later known as Sonny in WWE, and others. Arn Anderson had just finished a run with SMW. So had Cactus Jack, Chris Jericho, and Lance Storm. Cornette informed me that I would be forming a tag team with Eddie Gilbert, one of my mentors from Puerto Rico. Jim dubbed me Unabomb, which was not a reference to Ted Kaczynski, the domestic terrorist who had sent explosive packages to innocent people in the mail and became known as the Unabomber. Jim chose the name instead because he thought it sounded cool. Just as I had done in Puerto Rico, I wore a hockey mask into the ring, but took it off for the match. Best of all, Eddie and I were immediately thrown into a storyline with Ricky and Robert. I was getting a rivalry with the Rock and Roll Express. Talk about pumped. In early 1995, when I arrived in Knoxville to work for Cornette, I had no idea how much my life would change. I figured I would return home to the St. Louis area when my Smoky Mountain run was over, but that didn't happen. Instead, East Tennessee is where I met my wife, raised a family, and built my life. My first night in Knoxville, I split a room with Eddie at a hotel on Asheville Highway. The next day, we drove to SMW's monthly TV taping outside Knoxville. The day included matches and promos, all of which were edited together for TV stations across the Southeast. After a long day of matches and promos, Eddie headed back to his home in West Tennessee, while I stayed with some of the guys in an apartment they had rented. Within a week, Eddie called to tell me that he was taking over as the booker for Carlos Colon in Puerto Rico and was leaving immediately. This presented me with a real problem. We had just taped a month of TV featuring the two of us as a tag team and setting up an angle, wrestling jargon for storyline, with Ricky and Robert. In fact, our first live match was against them that weekend in Knoxville. Tragically, Eddie died from a heart attack shortly after his return to Puerto Rico. He was only 33 years old. Cornette ended up switching the tag team match to a singles contest between Ricky and me. There were a couple thousand people in the Knoxville Civic Coliseum, but to me, it might as well have been a sellout at Madison Square Garden. The arena looked huge and packed. Puerto Rico and Germany had been great, but this was different. I was in the ring with Ricky Morton, a guy whom I'd watched on TV, and I was in front of a good crowd in a real arena. It was a far cry from working in front of a few dozen people in a high school gym or National Guard armory. For the first time, I felt like a star. I really felt like a professional wrestler. Today, the office I occupy as mayor is across the street from the Knoxville Civic Coliseum. I see it every day I arrive and every time I leave. Literally every day, I drive to work, and it feels like I'm headed back there for my first match with Ricky Morton. Who would have thought when that match was going down in 1995 that a little more than 20 years later, I would be mayor of this place? That night, I lost my match to Ricky because of a disqualification. While my performance wasn't stellar, especially compared with someone as talented and as experienced as Ricky Morton, it was nevertheless more than adequate. During the next couple of weeks, I was booked against Ricky in smaller towns, back in the high school gyms and National Guard armories. Meanwhile, Cornette was busy finding me a new partner, and I got busy trying to find myself a more permanent housing arrangement. Crystal. We jokingly referred to the apartment where I had spent a couple nights on the sofa as the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Flophouse. Wrestler Anthony LaMonaco had his name on the lease, but he was a sport about helping other guys out by letting them stay there. Unfortunately for me, all the bedrooms were taken, so I set out to find my own apartment. The first place I moved was to a one-room efficiency apartment out in the country. It was cheap, but pretty depressing. I was there by myself, and my only social interactions occurred during my daily time at the gym. After about a month, I found another apartment in town and split the rent with SMW's Boo Bradley, who would go on to become Balls Mahoney for ECW. Though I was not living there, I found almost a second home in Anthony's apartment, aka the SMW Flophouse, which served as a gathering place for transplants like me from other areas of the country. Then one evening, a friend of Anthony's stopped by. Crystal Parker was accompanied by her two daughters, Devin and Arista, 11 and 8 respectively. Anthony occasionally babysat for the kids while Crystal was at work or school. I was immediately smitten by this beautiful woman whose red hair flowed out from under her Minnie Mouse ball cap. A couple of months later, wrestler D'Lo Brown suggested that I ask her out. I did. Not only was Crystal beautiful, she was smart, hardworking, determined, and kind-hearted. When I met her, Crystal was working on her master's degree in counseling from East Tennessee State University. At the same time, she was working full-time as a social worker, part-time at a convenience store in the evenings, and waiting tables at her mom's restaurant outside of Knoxville on the weekends. All this while raising two daughters. On our first date, we went to eat at the Bennigan's in Johnson City, Tennessee, where Crystal was living. Not very romantic, I know, but it was all that I could afford. Crystal and I hit it off very well. We spent as much time together as our busy schedules would allow. Devin, her older daughter, had broken her leg in a bicycle accident and spent weeks in the hospital with her leg in traction. So much of our early courtship involved passing time with Devin in the hospital, watching scary movies and playing board games. After a couple of months, we decided to get married. That was in August of 1995. Moving into the cramped little house where Crystal was living with her two daughters was a culture shock for me. Devin and Arista have very different personalities, and they often fought like cats and dogs. Our house was loud and chaotic at times. It was also fun and spontaneous. You never knew what Devin, the wild child, would be up to. Like all relationships, Crystal and I have had our ups and downs. As my career progressed, I spent much more time on the road than I did at home. That will cause strain within any marriage, but Crystal has always been a rock, strong and steady. She ran the household, usually while working full-time. To this day, she is the hardest working person I have ever met. She is also the most caring person I know. Like me, she's a big dog lover. Over the years, we have adopted dozens of fur babies. In a couple of cases, animals which have been severely neglected or abused. Just like their mom, my daughters are talented, hardworking young women. Both of them are nurses with postgraduate degrees. Devin is a nurse practitioner who works for a cardiac recovery group. Arista manages operations for a home health service in a neighboring county. Oh, and did I mention that I'm a grandpa? Yep, 2 grandchildren. And yes, it's true. Grandkids are the best gift in the entire world. Al Snow. By the time the next set of monthly TV tapings rolled around in Lenoir, North Carolina, Jimmy had found a new tag team partner for me, Al Snow. Al was a hot commodity on the independent circuit. He was talented and versatile in the ring and great on the mic, with a cocky in-ring persona. Behind the scenes, he was an intelligent, down-to-earth guy with an easygoing personality and a great sense of humor. Teaming with Al was an education for me, his years of experience compensating for my lack of it. Cornette called us the dynamic duo, but we got off to a bit of a rocky start. Al had just driven in from his home in Lima, Ohio, an 8-hour trip. In his first match on TV, he faced the veteran wrestler George South. George had never been a big name, but he was a terrific performer who had wrestled all around the world, including for WCW and WWE. Ric Flair even once said George was my favorite guy to work on TV. If you ever watched the World Championship Wrestling NWA TV show that came on at 6:05 p.m. Eastern Time on Superstation WTBS every Saturday, whether you watched it back in the 1980s or on the WWE Network today, you have seen George South wrestle. Cornette wanted their match to be filled with action that showcased Al's in-ring abilities. That's not the match he got. Al, exhausted from his drive, was doing his best to establish his heel persona. We all watched on the monitor backstage as Al ran from George, jumped out of the ring to get away from him, and tried, in a faux show of sportsmanship, to persuade George to shake his hand. Because pro wrestling is an art form and very subjective, wrestlers sometimes differ on a vision for the match. What do you want out of this? How do you go about portraying that to the audience? These are important creative questions for which there are usually different answers. A guy like Jim Cornette is acutely aware of these dynamics, so he patiently explained to Al and George that what he had seen in their first match wasn't what he was looking for. He wanted lots of action to show Al's athletic and wrestling prowess. He directed them to go back out and put on a short match with a series of high spots, wrestling parlance for good action, and he would edit the 2 matches together for television. When they went back out, the match only lasted about a minute, not the 5 minutes Jimmy had asked for. At this time, I was unaware that Jimmy possessed an explosive temper that was legendary in the wrestling business. When Al and George finished their match, Jim stared at the monitor for a full 30 seconds, repeating, "Is that it?" over and over. That's when Jim went from hot to nuclear. Jimmy's face began to change color. First red, then dark scarlet, before ultimately turning bright purple. As Jimmy's rage escalated, the other wrestlers ducked out of the room. I have never seen a conniption fit before, and it was something to behold. Jim sputtered and frothed, kicking at the furniture in the room and spitting out curses. Then the most amazing thing happened. Al and George walked into the room, and Jimmy reverted instantly to normal behavior. The man who had been a raging beast just a few seconds earlier told them in a voice as calm as a gentle summer breeze, "Guys, that wasn't really what I wanted, but I'll make it work." Fortunately, the rest of the night went like clockwork. And thanks to the magic of TV, Al's match with George looked seamless and got the point across. Al Snow was the real deal, and the dynamic duo was off to a great start. Meeting Vince. When I arrived at SMW, good old JR Jim Ross, a future Hall of Fame announcer, was on a hiatus from WWE and working as Cornette's TV announcer. JR took an immediate liking to me, and within a couple of months had arranged a tryout match with WWE. To the best of my recollection, I believe it took place in Macon, Georgia. There, I talked briefly with Vince McMahon, whom you know as WWE's chairman and CEO. I had always been taught that wrestlers were supposed to shake hands lightly with one another. When I went to shake hands with Vince in this traditional way, he immediately corrected me, warmly advising me to shake hands firmly with everyone I met. There was nothing mean or menacing about his remark. It was simply a bit of advice, and one that I've never forgotten. My match that night was against Reno Riggins, whom I had met a couple of years before. As in dancing, good matches require two competent performers to work well together. Luckily, I had a good, experienced partner in Reno. That day, he helped me deliver a great showing, one that included leapfrogs, drop kicks, and other athletic maneuvers. At the next SMW show, Cornette told me that WWE had been extremely impressed with my performance and that I should expect a phone call from them shortly. I was ecstatic. When I wasn't on the road wrestling, I was spending more and more time with Crystal. That wasn't always an easy task. She worked full-time as a social worker, had a part-time job at a convenience store, and was attending graduate school classes at East Tennessee State University. During the summer, she worked on weekends at her stepmother's restaurant on Douglas Lake, about half an hour east of Knoxville. In addition to all that, Crystal's older daughter, Devin, required special attention. While riding her bike in their backyard, she fell and broke her femur, the big bone in your thigh, in multiple places. For weeks, she was in the hospital with her leg in traction. Crystal and I spent many nights with Devin in her hospital room, eating fast food and watching movies. But overall, things were going along well. Al and I were competing for, and eventually won, the SMW Tag Team Championship. I had fallen in love with a wonderful woman and her family. I was happy. Then the phone call from WWE, the one that Cornette had told me to expect, finally came. Vince gives the good news and the bad. That was on April 19th, 1995. I remember the date well because I can recall turning on the TV that day to see Oklahoma City's Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in ruins, demolished by an act of terror that killed 168 people and shocked the nation. WWE's J.J. Dillon informed me that Vince McMahon wanted to meet with me. A few weeks later, I flew from Knoxville to LaGuardia Airport in New York. There, a limousine took me to the WWE offices in nearby Stamford, Connecticut. Now, before that, I had never been in a limousine. It was thrilling because it made me feel like I was on my way professionally. I'm going to be a WWE superstar, I thought to myself. Just like Ric Flair, I'd be limousine riding and jet flying. I arrived at WWE headquarters and was taken up to JJ's office. Vince walked in a few minutes later. After some small talk, we settled down to business. Vince wanted me to work for WWE, but he also wanted me to become more polished and to gain more experience. So he offered me a developmental contract. I would continue to work for SMW, with WWE subsidizing my pay there with a modest stipend. That sounded reasonable to me, and I verbally accepted. I felt like I was on a rocket ship. I'd just been chauffeured in a limo. Now I had a contract with WWE. Not a big money contract, but a contract nevertheless. Then my rocket ship blew an engine and plummeted earthward. Vince informed me that he had a character in mind that he'd wanted to do for a while. Next, he asked me, "Are you afraid of the dentist?" Now, I'd heard lots of stories from other wrestlers about how Vince was a master of getting inside your head, kind of an evil genius who could tell you what you were thinking before you thought it. But I had no idea what the point of his question was, so I simply answered, "No, sir." He chuckled and told me his idea. A wrestling dentist named Isaac Yankem. I yank him. Vince laughed in his Vince laugh. "You'll be perfect for it," he told me as he got up to leave. One of the things that Eddie Gilbert taught me was to maintain a poker face when presented with match finishes, storylines, and pretty much everything else in wrestling. You put yourself at a disadvantage if you let anyone know that you are unhappy with a situation. Many wrestlers earn a bad reputation by putting on the boo-boo face when they are unhappy with their role, instead of adopting a professional demeanor. I kept Eddie's lesson in mind as I sat there digesting what Vince had just told me. On the outside, I did my best to act excited for this opportunity. On the inside, my emotions were completely different. From the start, I hated the idea of Isaac Yankem. Here I was, 6'8" and 315 pounds, and Vince McMahon wanted me to be a ridiculous wrestling dentist. This is a nightmare, I thought. I chastised myself, sure that I had just made an enormous mistake. How in the world was I ever going to get over being a wrestling dentist? In my mind, that character was destined for failure before it happened. Looking back, of course, my attitude wasn't very constructive. In fact, I was being a prima donna. With the luxury of hindsight, I now realize how fortunate I was. Most wrestlers never get to see the inside of WWE headquarters, much less sit down and talk with Vince McMahon, much less sign with the company. I didn't think about it at the time, but I still had a lot to learn. I was also still a long way from being the performer I would one day become. Isaac Yankem gave me the ability to fail while I was learning. While I still didn't much like the character, I understand today that it was a step I had to take. My later success would never have occurred had I not played that role in WWE first. Back in SMW, the dynamic duo was hot. Al and I continued our rivalry with the Rock and Roll Express and also had a nice program with Tracy Smothers and Tony Anthony. We also worked against the Armstrong family, Bullet Bob and his son, Brian, aka Road Dogg. Although I never wrestled him, I also loved to watch Brad Armstrong, another of Bob's sons. Along with Ricky Steamboat, Brad was the best pure babyface I've ever seen. WWE sometimes loaned its stars to SMW. In fact, the night that Al and I won the SMW Tag Team Championship, Undertaker was on the card. That show was Bluegrass Brawl 3 on April 7th, 1995 in Pikeville, Kentucky. Al and I defeated Ricky and Robert that night in a coal miner's glove match. It was my first championship in sports entertainment. But the real draw that night was the Gangstas and D'Lo Brown versus Tracy Smothers and Undertaker in a 3-on-2 handicap match. The build-up to that match was phenomenal, with Cornette displaying his incomparable creative talent, including producing one of the most memorable vignettes I have ever seen. It featured Undertaker digging a grave while Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper played in the background. In his deep, macabre voice, Undertaker sent a message to the Gangstas, who draped gang flags over the bodies of their fallen victims following their matches. As he shoveled, Undertaker said, "Gangstas, you bury your victims under a flag. I bury mine under 6 feet of cold, hard dirt." Genius. While SMW appeared in markets like Knoxville and Johnson City, We spent most of our time in small towns throughout Appalachia. Some of them were so small that I referred to them as witness protection towns. If you were in the FBI's witness protection program, you'd be safe there because most people don't know these places even exist. Towns like Princeton, West Virginia, Council, Virginia, and West Liberty, Kentucky. Every town had a story, and you never knew what you'd learn. For instance, one evening we pulled into Flatwoods, Kentucky, population 7,000. As we drove into town, we were welcomed by this sign. "Welcome to Flatwoods," it read in big letters. "Home of Billy Ray Cyrus." Unfortunately, Billy Ray didn't make it to the show that night. Neither did most of the rest of Flatwoods, as our crowd numbered only a few dozen. The highlight of my SMW career came on August 4th, 1995, at the Knoxville Civic Coliseum in front of 5,000 people. That night was the first of what would be many matches against Undertaker. The Super Bowl of Wrestling was an all-star show featuring not only Undertaker, but also Shawn Michaels. I had met Undertaker, Mark Calloway, a couple of times before, but this was the first time that I had a chance to spend time with him. Even as heralded as he is, Mark's understanding of pro wrestling psychology is probably not as appreciated as it should be. The Undertaker character is so strong that half the battle is getting the crowd to accept that Undertaker is in jeopardy at any point in the match, especially when he's wrestling an unknown commodity like me. Mark structured the match that night in such a way that the crowd bought into me taking the fight to him. It worked. Despite my nerves, after all, this was the biggest match of my career by far. We pulled off a good showing. Of course, most of it was due to the popularity of Undertaker, but I did my part. For me, the most important outcome of that night was proving to Mark that I had the talent to be in the ring with him. For the rest of my career, Mark Calloway would be one of my biggest advocates. And for that, I am forever grateful to him. Trust me, having Undertaker in your corner is some powerful mojo. A few weeks later, I had my last match in SMW at Fire on the Mountain in Johnson City, where I lost a loser leaves town match. That night was bittersweet. I was headed to WWE, which had been my goal since entering sports entertainment, but I was comfortable at SMW, had made some good friends there, and would miss them. Since SMW was a regional promotion, I could drive to nearly every town from home and back again in a short period of time, so I was usually at home every night, which allowed me to spend time with Crystal and the kids. That would change in WWE, where you sometimes spent weeks at a time on the road. Nevertheless, whether I was ready for it or not, the next chapter in my life was about to begin. Chapter 3, Isaac Yankem.
All right. That is all we have for today. This is the first part of Mayor Kane, My Life in Wrestling Politics, the audiobook part 1. Thank you guys for coming out. As you know, we hear about Kane, how he started his wrestling career, how he was a former football player, how he met his wife. He is a stepfather to her 2 children and now a grandfather. And then he also talks about people that he, how he met in the politics world and how he became the mayor. But he mostly talks about his beginning stages of the WWE career. One of the many characters he plays is Isaac Yankem, which is the wrestling dentist, as he stated. Very interesting story by Kane. Kane really has an interesting story. He's the youngest child. Did not know he's born in Spain. So, but definitely, this is a great audiobook thus far. Like I said before, we almost 2 hours in. We are hour 54 in, but there will be 2 more parts, more than likely, to this audiobook. If there doesn't stretch out a little bit longer, maybe 4 to say the most, honestly. But other than that, though, this is the first part of the audiobook, which is a great book. This book was released, as you guys, if I didn't say before, it debuted in 2019. So this book is going on about 5 years old now. This is the first book he had as, I think, period. And this is a book he wrote himself. And he also narrates himself. So people, I know you guys in the comments ask, is this Kane speaking? This is Kane narrating his whole audiobook from beginning to middle and end. This is not AI. This is nobody impersonating Kane. This is Kane speaking in the audiobook himself. Definitely Kane. Carl, my salute to you. Thanks for coming out. This is Kane speaking. Like I said, I know some people asked me earlier. This is not no AI. This is Kane speaking throughout the whole audio book. Like I said, I will keep the notification bell on. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you guys can be alerted once the other parts of this audiobook are released to the channel, so you won't miss out on that. And also, I'll say it earlier, I'll say it again, for parts after this part here 2 and onward, there will be links to the previous part of the audiobook in the link description below. Now this part obviously does not have a link description because this is the first part, but for parts 2, 3, and maybe 4, if possible, there will be a link to the previous part in that particular one. And also it will be in a playlist called Wrestling Audiobooks. So keep an eye out for that too. And then also there are other audiobooks in that playlist, such as Becky Lynch, The Man, You're Not Your Average Girl, Ronda Rousey, Our Fight, Mick Foley, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and most recently Chris Jericho, No is a 4-letter word. All of those audiobooks plus this one here will be in that playlist of wrestling audiobooks of the audiobook library here at this channel. So guys, keep an eye out for that if you want to check out more. But like I said, Kane is really, from what I've heard thus far, is really good. If you guys missed out on the audiobook here, you can check this on the playback. And like I said, keep an eye out for the other parts as well, because there will be more. This is not the only part. But yeah, Kane really outdid himself. Very, very good part of this book. Also, too, Kane, like I said, there'll be 2 parts of this book. He'll talk about his wrestling career, and he mostly later on will talk about his political career. If you guys are interested in listening to the political career, you're more than welcome to. If you don't, you want to log off later on in the parts of the audiobook, you're welcome to do that too. If you have your reservations towards political, especially wrestling being a political, business pretty much. But also this, like I said, Kane, so most haven't heard him speak, and he has very, very lot to say. Very interesting. And I like how he describes himself and other things in his audiobook. And also he definitely worked his way to get where he's at, worked at Smoky Mountain Wrestling and many others, to say the least. Did not start from, in WWE. He did definitely have to work his way, worked with Jim Cornette. He worked with Al Snow, worked with Jeff Jarrett and his dad in his territory as well, the late Jerry Jarrett. So, like I said, guys, other than that, this is Kane, My Life of Wrestling Politics, Glenn Jacobs. It's the real life Kane. Kane speaking throughout the whole audiobook, and he is giving you his insight and his point of view on his life, his autobiography of being a wrestler and now a mayor of Tennessee. So very interesting. Stay tuned. There will be more. And I thank you all for coming out, checking out the audiobook, as there will be more in audiobook as well. So definitely check that out. I can't stress that enough. And that's all I have for Mayor Kane, My Life in Wrestling Politics Audio Part 1. You guys have tell me how you feel about the book in the live chat here and also on the playback. He said that's crazy. My cousin name's Kane. That is interesting. All right, two videos will pop up for here will be other audiobooks. First one could be the Stone Cold Truth audiobook. Check that out. Next one will be Chris Jericho. No, it's a 4-letter word audio part 1. Until then, it is OUT.